remove the freedoms before the program reaches you. There are also free software licenses which are not copyleft, and they do permit proprietary modified versions. So in those licenses they recognize everyone's freedom, but with copyleft we go even further and we actively defend everybody's freedom. In any case, when Linux had switched to a free software license, the result was that it was possible to use Linux to fill the last gap in the GNU system. And the result was a complete free operating system, which was basically GNU with Linux added. The development of Linux, the kernel, was an important contribution to the free software community, because that was the step that carried us across the finish line. Before that, we had lots of good free programs, and there were many who used them. But in order to use them, they had to install them on top of some other non-free operating system. After the last step had been taken, we had a complete free operating system, and it was possible to install that in a bare PC. And thus, the goal we had set out for 8 years before had been reached. It was possible for the first time to get a PC and use it in freedom as part of a community. So Linux itself was an important contribution to our community. But the confusion of thinking that this entire combination was Linux was a big blow to the free software movement, because it broke the connection from our software to our philosophy. Before that, there were many people who installed specific GNU components, and they knew they were installing GNU components. So when they saw the articles that described our philosophy, the same philosophy I've been telling you today, they would see them and say, ah, this is the philosophy behind those programs I like so much. So they would read it and pay attention. This doesn't mean that they all agreed with us, but at least we had a chance to convince them. And if they did agree with us, with our philosophy, then they would feel motivated to develop more free software. So the software spread the philosophy, and the philosophy helped extend the software. But once millions of people started using essentially a variant of the GNU system with Linux as the kernel, and thinking that the whole thing was Linux, then it didn't lead them to our philosophy anymore. Instead, it led them to look for moral guidance to the developer of Linux, because they were told, here you have the Linux system. And so they thought of themselves as Linux users, and they heard that he was the author of Linux. So they thought that the whole thing came from his vision. And what was the vision he told them? He said, I just did this to have fun. I don't want to think about politics. All software licenses are okay, and you have to obey them no matter what they say. And then he was developing proprietary software in his work, and he said so. And then he was using a non-free program to develop Linux publicly. And so he very visibly disagrees with the philosophy of the free software movement, and always has. Well, he has a right to his views. What I don't like is when people attribute our work that was based on our campaign for freedom to him and think that it's an advertisement for his views. And that's why I ask you, please call the system GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux. Because when the people think they're Linux users and they see the articles about the philosophy of GNU, they say, that has nothing to do with me. I'm a Linux user. They tend to ignore us. Now, if you want to explain the philosophy of the free software movement to other people, that can be a very useful thing to do, especially once you learn to do a good job of it. But that takes time. And you may not want to spend all your time explaining this. But it only takes 1 second to say GNU/ in front of Linux. So if you were going to mention the system 20 times a day, it'll take you 20 seconds a day to say GNU/ each time. Now, it's true that this doesn't explain the philosophy to people. You can't explain the philosophy in 1 second or even in 20 seconds. But you can prepare other people so that when they see our explanation, they will pay more attention. And that's what you do when you call the system GNU/Linux. It's not just a matter of giving the GNU developers the credit that we deserve, although we do deserve it. It's more important than that. It's the easiest, most time-efficient way that you can spread awareness of these issues of freedom among the others who use or have heard of the system that we developed for the sake of freedom. The GNU system is the only operating system that was developed specifically for the sake of freedom and community. Other operating systems were developed for technical or commercial reasons. This is the one operating system developed for the sake of freedom. And people are in danger, and this fact is being forgotten even by its own users. You see, history tells us that freedom does not persist automatically. Freedom is always in danger of being lost. And if people want to continue to have freedom, they must be prepared to defend it. And defending freedom is often not easy. But in order to defend freedom, people have to value freedom. And in order to value freedom, people have to know what it is. In other areas of life, at least that part's taken care of. It's not easy to defend freedom of the press in Italy or the U.S. But at least people know what it is. A couple of months ago, we saw freedom of the press threatened around the world. First, some newspapers published cartoons making fun of Muhammad in a rather mild way, and we saw a bunch of fanatics try to punish whole countries for allowing that freedom of the press. And then we saw a Turkish movie which depicts the United States as an evil, conquering power that tortures people, which would be a nasty thing to say if it weren't the truth. And then we saw the entire country of Turkey being condemned for the fact that it had the freedom of speech necessary to make this movie. So freedom of speech was getting it from both sides. Teaching people to really respect freedom of speech, which means that anybody can be criticized, any view can be criticized, no view is so sacred that it can't be made fun of, is often hard. But at least people know the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, because speech and the press have existed for a long time, and these ideas have been promoted for centuries. But computing is new. It's just 10 years, I think, since